Hello guys! What if I told you that in medieval times, your parents could choose your spouse before you even met them? Love letters were rare luxuries, and dating, as we know it, didn't really exist at all. No texting, no dating apps, no let's see where this goes. Instead, romance was a mix of politics, survival, and occasionally real love. Tonight, we're stepping back into a world of castles, candlelight, strict rules, and surprisingly complicated relationships. Because medieval dating, it wasn't simple, but it was fascinating. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving deep into what dating, relationships, and love looked like in medieval times. And when I say dating, I'm using the term loosely. Because for most people back then, romance wasn't about finding the one. It was about family, survival, alliances, and social status. But within all of that, there were still emotions, still attraction, still human connection. So let's explore how people met, married, flirted, and sometimes rebelled in a time that feels completely different from our own. Let's start with the biggest difference. Dating, as a concept, didn't really exist. You didn't go out for coffee. You didn't casually talk for months. There was no trial and error phase. Instead, relationships moved quickly toward one goal: marriage. And for most people, especially women, marriage wasn't a personal choice. It was arranged. Families would negotiate marriages based on land, wealth, power, or social advantage. Love, that was optional, sometimes completely irrelevant. Imagine being 14 or 15, and your entire future being decided in a conversation you weren't even part of. That was normal. Parents, especially fathers, had the final say. Among nobles, marriages were like business deals. Two families would come together, discuss dowries, alliances, and political benefits, and agree on a match. The couple might meet briefly beforehand, or not at all. And once the agreement was made, that was it. You were expected to accept it. But here's where things get interesting. Even though marriages were arranged, people still experienced love. They just didn't always experience it within marriage. In fact, emotional connection often developed later, slowly, over time, or sometimes outside of marriage altogether. Which brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval romance. Courtly love was a kind of romantic ideal, mostly among the nobility. It was dramatic, poetic, and often forbidden. A knight might devote himself to a lady, usually someone already married, and express his admiration through poetry, songs, or acts of bravery. It wasn't always physical. In many cases, it was about admiration, longing, and emotional intensity. Think of it as medieval-era situationships, but with way more poetry and way less texting. So, how did people flirt? Subtly, very subtly. A glance across a room, a shared dance at a feast, a carefully worded letter. Even something as simple as offering a token, a ribbon, a glove, could carry deep meaning. Because in a world full of rules, even small gestures matter. Now, if you weren't a noble, things were a bit different. Peasants had more freedom when it came to choosing partners. Not complete freedom, but more. They met through daily life, working in fields, attending village gatherings, or celebrating festivals. Love matches were more common here, though practical concerns still played a big role. After all, marriage meant survival. Two people working together, building a life, supporting a family. The church had a major influence on relationships. Marriage was considered sacred. And there were strict rules about who you could marry, when you could marry, and even how relationships should function. Certain days were off limits. Certain relationships were forbidden. And breaking these rules could have serious consequences. So even love had boundaries. Weddings themselves were important, but not always elaborate. What mattered most was the agreement. Once married, roles were clearly defined. Men worked, provided, made decisions. Women managed the home, raised children, supported the household. It was structured, predictable, and often not very flexible. When we think of medieval romance, we often imagine castles, knights, and fairy tale love stories. But the reality was more grounded, more practical. Love existed, but it wasn't always the priority. Stability was, survival was, community was. Of course, not everyone followed the rules. There were secret relationships, hidden meetings, forbidden love stories. People have always found ways to choose love, even when the system didn't allow it. And those stories, they're often the ones that lasted the longest. Now think about today. Dating apps, endless choices, freedom to explore, connect, and decide. It's almost the complete opposite. But in some ways, the core hasn't changed. People still want connection, still want understanding, still want to feel seen. So what was dating like in medieval times? Structured, restricted, often decided for you, but still deeply human. Because no matter the century, no matter the system, people have always searched for connection. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know what time period we should explore next. And next time you open a dating app, just remember, at least you get to choose. See you in the next one.
Now let's say you actually like someone who makes your calloused heart flutter. You lock eyes at the well. There's a spark. It's romantic. It's poetic. It's completely irrelevant, because unless your families are on equal financial footing, you might as well fall in love with a cloud. If you're noble, it gets worse. Your hand in marriage is tied to land, borders, and political favours. You're not just a person. You're a walking treaty. Congratulations. Even peasants aren't safe. Marriage is practical. You don't marry for butterflies. You marry because your pig pen borders someone else's wheat field. You dream of passion. You settle for irrigation rights. And yet, you try. Maybe you offer a small gift, a carved spoon, a handful of berries, or your finest slightly cracked mug. Maybe they smile. Maybe they don't. But the truth remains. In medieval dating, economics is the flirting, and love is just a bonus you hope your spouse develops eventually. So let's say you're not a peasant worrying about pigs or a noble dealing with treaties. Let's say you're a knight. Shiny armour, big horse, questionable poetry skills. What's your love life like? Welcome to the strange and emotionally exhausting world of courtly love. Now, this isn't dating. This is performance art. Courtly love was a noble pastime, part flirting, part spiritual suffering, and entirely impractical. You, the brave knight, choose a noble lady, usually one who's already married, and vow to adore her from afar. Not physically, of course. That would ruin everything. No, you're supposed to suffer. Elegantly. You might compose a few tortured verses about her silver laugh, or how her hair burns like the sun, which, in medieval terms, means she has hair and didn't insult your family. You wear her colours at tournaments. You pine. You sigh. You occasionally joust someone just because he glanced at her too long. The lady's role? She's supposed to pretend this is all very flattering while maintaining a level of icy detachment that would terrify a glacier. She may respond with a letter, a token, maybe a ribbon, but mostly she'll just be mysterious and unattainable, which is the entire point. The emotions are high, the actual contact, minimal. At best, you might get a nod from across the hall or a finger brushed against your gauntlet during a feast. Anything more, and suddenly it's not courtly love. It's a scandal. Or worse, adultery. And no one wants that. At least, not officially. This entire setup worked best when everyone involved agreed it was mostly pretend. It was a way to express longing, devotion, and creative angst, all without disrupting the social order. A medieval venting mechanism, if you will. Was it dramatic? Absolutely. Did it involve more poetry than practicality? Constantly. But for a night stuck between battles and boredom, courtly love gave you something to write about, and someone to write for. Just don't expect a happy ending, or a kiss, or even eye contact. So you've fallen for someone. Great. Now comes the hard part, expressing that affection in a society where touching someone's hand without a chaperone is basically a declaration of war. Welcome to the medieval solution, tokens. Think of it as 12th century texting, slow, confusing, and open to wildly inaccurate interpretation. Let's say you're a knight and you're hopelessly in love with Lady Marjorie, of whatever her last name is. You can't speak to her alone, and your poems keep getting intercepted by her confessor. What do? You send her a glove. Or maybe your embroidered sleeve. Nothing says I love you like mailing someone part of your wardrobe. And if you're on the receiving end? Congratulations. You now have a sweaty linen sleeve you didn't ask for, and the romantic burden of pretending you know what it means. Is he confessing love? Asking for a favour? Suggesting a duel? Who knows? Women gave tokens too. A ribbon, a piece of hair, a tiny pendant. It was sentimental, sure, but also deeply strategic. Give the wrong guy the wrong token, and suddenly you're spoken for by someone with a lazy eye and a drinking problem. Tokens were meant to be subtle. A glove pinned to your chest, a ribbon tied to your sword hilt. Everyone knew what it meant, and no one said what it meant. The more cryptic, the better. It was less about communication and more about plausible deniability. Oh, this glove? No, it's not from Lady Joan. It just appeared on my pillow, scented with lavender, completely random. For commoners, tokens were simpler. Maybe a wood carving, maybe a handkerchief you stitched when you weren't milking something. It was still romantic, just with more calluses involved. Tokens were also risky. Giving one to the wrong person could spark rumours. Receiving one you didn't want meant figuring out how to politely return someone's sock without insulting their lineage. But for all the awkwardness, these tokens carried real emotional weight. They were symbols of love in a world that didn't allow much room for it. So you finally build up the courage to talk to your crush. Maybe offer them a flower. Maybe quote a little bad poetry you definitely didn't steal from a travelling minstrel. You're ready for a moment of intimacy. Unfortunately, you're not alone. Welcome to the world of medieval dating surveillance, where love is never blind. It's heavily monitored by your mother, your priest, a nosy cousin, and sometimes all three at once. Let's say you're a young woman of marrying age. You're never just going for a walk. You're going for a walk with Margaret and her terrifyingly strict aunt, who's already judging your posture. Even if you're simply fetching water, someone is watching. Someone is always watching. It's less dating, more espionage. And if you're a man trying to court someone, better hope you have the approval of her family, her parish priest, and the local gossip network. You show up at her house with flowers? Her father's behind the door, sharpening something. Her mother's pretending to stir a pot that hasn't boiled in 3 hours, and the village priest just happens to be passing by, on his way to morning prayers, at sunset. The logic behind all this supervision was simple. Protect virtue, preserve family honour, and absolutely prevent any unsanctioned touching, especially before marriage, especially alone, especially ever. Chaperones were there to monitor innocent interactions. Group outings, monitored, walks, supervised, sitting within a 2-meter radius of each other on a bench. Only if someone's grandmother is knitting nearby and pretending not to listen. The church, of course, had opinions. Lots of them. It regulated courtship the way a bouncer regulates a nightclub. Priests gave sermons about proper conduct and wrote lengthy treatises on the dangers of flirtation. Yes, that's right. Medieval clergy published anti-flirting manuals. Imagine someone copying those out by candlelight while monks silently judge you from across the scriptorium. Even letter writing wasn't safe. Some monasteries opened love letters just to screen for moral content. That's right, divine censorship. So if you want to fall in love, you'll have to get used to doing it quietly, and in the presence of your entire extended family, and possibly God. So, you're in love. Or at least medieval in love, which is mostly longing, confusion, and a lot of pacing near windows. You've exchanged glances across a feast. Maybe they picked up your dropped handkerchief and didn't immediately throw it into the fire. The tension is unbearable. But you still can't speak freely. There are chaperones, priests, mothers lurking like emotional border patrol agents. So what do? You write a letter. Ah, yes, the secret love letter. The most dangerous piece of parchment since the excommunication notice. This is your chance to confess your heart, using the most cryptic, overly poetic language possible. Because you can't just say, I like you. You must say, my soul is a stag, pierced by the arrow of your grace, roaming the forests of yearning. Naturally, if you're literate, which, let's be honest, isn't a given, you pen your message on vellum or rough parchment. If you're really dedicated, you dust it with flower petals or perfume. Just be careful with that. One noble accidentally used a love letter to wrap a herring and delivered it to the wrong girl. They're married now. It's fine. Now comes the problem of delivery. You can't just hand it over. You need a courier, a loyal servant, a bribed monk, or a younger sibling with limited understanding of consequences. Sometimes even a minstrel would do the job, singing your poem in the town square while pretending it was anonymous. Subtle. And the poetry? Risky. Very risky. The line between romantic and heresy was thinner than a monk's patience during Lent. If your metaphor even hinted at anything physical, you might find yourself confessing to both lust and literary exaggeration. But despite all the rules, people did write. Some letters survived. Some poems were copied and passed around like forbidden fruit. In a world of rigid roles and constant supervision, a folded scrap of words could feel revolutionary. So you write, you risk it. You press your trembling hand to the parchment and say everything you can't say aloud. Just don't sign it too clearly. You want romance, not a church trial. Finally, a break, a feast day, a harvest festival, a maypole dance. In short, a rare moment when your life isn't just work, prayer, and pretending you're not interested in the blacksmith's daughter. Today, you're allowed to flirt. Sort of. As long as no one sees. Or everyone sees, but pretends not to. Welcome to medieval festivals, where romance blooms under the watchful eyes of everyone you've ever met, and 3 chickens. Festivals were one of the few socially approved moments when men and women could mingle, laugh, and, dare we say, make eye contact. There's music, there's ale, there's someone wearing a flower crown with dangerous confidence. You've never seen so many people not pretending to be miserable. If you're a peasant, you might try to impress your crush by winning the sack race, catching a greased pig, or juggling 3 stale rolls of bread. Nothing says, I'm available, like falling off a hay bale with dignity. Dancing was your best shot at actual physical contact. The rules were rigid, but a well-timed spin or a not-quite-accidental hand graze could say more than any poem. The maypole dance, for example, was basically a giant excuse for coordinated flirtation wrapped in ribbons and plausible deniability. And if you're noble? Your version of flirting at a festival involved less hay and more poetry. You might compose a verse on the spot, compare your lady's eyes to twin candles, or other glowing things, and offer a trinket. Hopefully not one that was clearly made by your servant 5 minutes earlier. Food helped too. Offer your beloved a meat pie, or share a honey cake. If they accept it with a smile, you're doing well. If they hand it to their dog, start over with someone else. But remember, everything you do, someone is watching. A parent, a priest, a bard with a big mouth. One misstep, and your flirty smile becomes a youthful indiscretion discussed at church for the next 6 weeks. Still, for a few hours you can pretend. Pretend you're in a world where love isn't a transaction, where laughter isn't suspicious, and where dancing in public doesn't end in penance. Let's say you're not a knight, a noble, or a bard with a lute and excessive feelings. You're a regular villager. You wake up with the cows, go to bed with the chickens, and spend most of your day ankle-deep in mud. You're not looking for a poetic soulmate. You're looking for someone who can milk a goat without emotional drama. Welcome to peasant courtship, where romance is practical, gestures are modest, and chemistry means we can survive winter together. In your world, dating is less about long conversations and more about shared tasks. You notice someone you like because they work hard, don't complain much, and have a decent set of teeth. That's it. That's the whole checklist. You're not picky. You're realistic. You don't need fireworks. You need someone who can gut a fish and maybe doesn't snore too loudly. So how do you show interest? You give gifts, small, useful things. A basket of eggs, a bundle of firewood, a good turnip. And if you're feeling bold, maybe a woven ribbon or a carved spoon. Nothing says, "I'm serious about you," like a spoon you whittled by candlelight while your pig judged you silently. Conversations happen during shared chores. You might walk together to the mill, chat while tending sheep, or exchange pleasantries while shoveling something that smells questionable. No one's reciting poetry. You're talking about the weather, crop yields, and whether or not old Thomas fell in the well again. And yet, in its own way, it's romantic. There's a sweetness in the simplicity. A shared life built not on idealism, but on cooperation. You know each other's strengths, weaknesses, and how fast they run when a goat escapes. Proposals often came quickly. If you both agreed, and the families did too, marriage followed. Maybe you moved into a shared hut. Maybe you built a new one from scratch with help from the village. You brought your best blanket. They brought a goat. Together, you began the strange miracle of domestic survival. It's not glamorous, but it's honest. You've done it. You found someone who can cook, clean, tolerate your family, and doesn't visibly recoil at the sight of your feet. True love, right? Now it's time to get married, which, in medieval terms, means you're entering into a contract. Not a dreamy vow under the stars. A legally binding transaction, often negotiated with all the passion of a livestock auction. If you're a peasant, it's still a big deal. You gather a few witnesses, talk to the local priest, and try not to trip over the Latin during the ceremony. But behind the sweet-sounding blessings is a serious checklist. Dowry, land rights, who gets the cow, and what happens if someone dies during planting season. Ah yes, romance. If you're from the upper class, buckle up. Your marriage is a full-blown legal negotiation. Your parents, their parents, the priest, a scribe, maybe a cousin who once studied law. They're all in on it. The bride and groom, mostly just standing nearby, looking decorative and nodding when spoken to. You may or may not have even met the person you're marrying. Your family has done the math. Your estate needs her fields, her dowry balances your debts, and both of your coats of arms look good next to each other. Love is optional. The merger is not. And once you're married, it's permanent. Divorce isn't really a thing unless you can prove someone wasn't baptized, was secretly related to you, or died and forgot to mention it. Annulments existed, but they required a lot of paperwork, a bit of luck, and a solid bribe. Still, not everything is bleak. Some couples genuinely grew to love each other, shared chores, raising children, surviving winters. These things have a way of building affection, or at least tolerance, which in medieval terms is basically the same thing. The church was involved in every step. Marriage was a holy sacrament, one of the 7 big ones. You didn't just marry for legal reasons, you married because God needed a witness. Possibly 2. So you stand, exchange vows, and smile as someone hands over a sack of onions and calls it a blessing. So, let's say you've had enough. Enough contracts, enough negotiations, enough being treated like a particularly valuable sack of flour. You're a noble, but for once, you want to marry for love. Not for land, not for lineage, not for your father's strategic ambitions, just love. Congratulations, you're about to cause a scandal. Noble elopements were the medieval equivalent of lighting your family tree on fire and dancing in the ashes. If you ran off to marry someone of your own choosing, it wasn't just personal rebellion, it was political sabotage. Let's say you're Lady Eleanor, promised to Sir Boring von Estate Secure, but you've fallen madly in love with a penniless squire who smells faintly of horses and adventure. You meet in secret, whisper sweet nothings in the stables, and one day, you vanish. Off to a monastery where the abbot owes you a favour. There you marry under questionable legality, with only a nervous monk and 2 chickens as witnesses. Back at home, chaos. Your family? Outraged. Your father? Threatening to siege the groom's family garden. Your mother? Crying into her embroidery hoop. The church? Deeply concerned. The gossip? Delicious. And if you're the groom in this romantic rebellion, don't get too comfortable. Best case scenario? You get to keep your bride and your kneecaps. Worst case? You're excommunicated and disemboweled, in that order. Still, some couples got away with it. If the union couldn't be undone without causing even more embarrassment, families sometimes just sighed and moved on. After all, what's done is done, and at least nobody died. Hopefully. In rare cases, these scandals became legends. Songs were written, poems composed, stories whispered at banquets. 2 nobles who chose love over duty. Practically mythological. And yes, most noble marriages were transactional, but these moments, brief rebellions, passionate escapes, whispered vows beneath moonlit towers, they reminded the world that love, though inconvenient, refused to go extinct. So if you ever feel dramatic for swiping left or turning down a second date, just remember, at least your love life doesn't involve secret weddings, angry barons, and a horse tied to a ladder outside your window. Ah, marriage. That beautiful union of 2 souls, and their respective financial portfolios. Because in the Middle Ages love was nice, but a dowry? Now that was truly romantic. Let's say you're a bride. You're not just getting married, you're being launched, like a small dowry-equipped economic vessel. Your family prepares your dowry, money, livestock, land, linens, a cow or 2, depending on how lovable they think you are, and maybe even a set of pewter dishes if they're feeling generous. These offerings go to your future husband, who accepts you and your portable wealth with open arms and a mental calculator. Now flip the scenario. In some cultures or regions, it's not the bride's family giving the goods, it's the bride price. The groom pays her family for the honour of marrying her, effectively saying, "Here's a horse, a cloak, and 3 pigs. Now give me your daughter." Medieval romance at its finest. The point is, someone is paying someone. You're getting married, and there is absolutely a receipt involved. These exchanges weren't just about wealth. They were about status, expectations, and public statements. A large dowry might indicate a bride came from a prestigious family. A stingy one might suggest they were trying to offload her quickly, possibly due to suspicious personality traits or a habit of talking back. You, as the bride, didn't usually get to keep your dowry. It became part of the household economy, managed by your husband, guarded by the law, and hopefully not gambled away on dice and ale within the first month of marriage. If the marriage ended, through death, annulment, or your husband wandering off to join a monastery after midlife regret, your dowry could theoretically be returned. But retrieving it was often harder than pulling a sword from a stone. You'd need support, legal backing, and ideally someone who could read. Meanwhile, the bride price, if paid, was like buying a rare goat, expensive up front and no refunds. It compensated the bride's family for the loss of her labour. After all, who's going to milk the sheep now? So while love was occasionally in the mix, money was always at the altar. So you didn't go the marriage route. Maybe you were the second son, or your dowry was suspiciously small, or you just really liked chanting. Either way, you've joined a monastery or convent. Congratulations, you've now taken a vow of poverty, chastity, and an aggressive disinterest in romance. And yet, here you are, in a stone cloister surrounded by silence, candle smoke, and Brother Anselm's unexpectedly soulful eyes. Yes, even behind monastery walls, forbidden love found a way. To be clear, falling in love in a religious order was deeply discouraged. Like, you might get whipped, exiled, or lectured by someone with a Latin name, discouraged. You've sworn to give your heart entirely to God, which means giving it to literally no one else. But hearts are unruly, and sometimes prayers start sounding a lot like love poems. Maybe it starts with innocent tasks. Passing each other bread in the refectory, whispering during Vespers, laughing a little too hard when someone drops a hymnal. Before you know it, you're tucking extra cheese into Sister Beatrice's satchel and questioning everything. Some monks and nuns wrote passionate letters, disguised, of course, as theological musings. Your soul is a shining light in the darkness of my contemplation sounds holy, unless you read between the lines. And many did. There were, inevitably, scandals, secret meetings in the herb garden, midnight confessions that weren't strictly sacramental, and the occasional gasp-worthy discovery of a nun with a suspiciously round belly. The punishment, usually harsh, exile, public penance, or being reassigned to some far-off abbey known mostly for sheep and silence. Still, not all stories ended in disgrace. Some lovers escaped. A few even got married after being defrocked. Most, though, returned to their cloisters, red-faced and redevoted, swearing that the whole thing was just an overzealous theological debate. Because in the end, monastic life was about discipline. But humans are humans, even in robes, even in silence. And sometimes a quiet glance across the chapel was more thrilling than any tournament or courtly poem. You did it. You got married. There was a priest, a pig roast, and someone spilled mead on your mother's only nice cloak. But now it's been a few months, or years, and something feels off. Maybe your spouse snores like a dying lute. Maybe they forgot to mention their chronic gambling problem. Or maybe you just realized that marrying for land and sheep doesn't automatically result in romantic bliss. Either way, welcome to the world of medieval marital disappointment. Now, don't go reaching for the divorce papers, because they don't exist. At least, not in any form you'd recognize. Marriage was a sacred and unbreakable bond, approved by the Church, sealed by God, and enforced by public shame. You could try for an annulment, but you'd need a very good reason. We don't get along doesn't cut it. You'd have to prove that one of you was underage, already married, too closely related, which happened disturbingly often, or, best case scenario, never consummated the marriage, which meant someone had to confirm that fact, in writing, possibly under oath. Good luck. If you're a noble, it gets messier. Your marriage wasn't just personal, it was political. Trying to escape it could start a feud, ignite a scandal, or launch a minor war. Best to just quietly resent each other and attend separate feasts. So what do unhappy couples do? Mostly they just endure. You sleep in different beds. You sigh dramatically at dinner. You pour your feelings into embroidery, or that one really angry psalm. Passive aggression becomes your love language. Of course, affairs happened, usually quietly, sometimes spectacularly. Nobles had secret lovers. Peasants had suspiciously helpful neighbours. The Church condemned it, of course, but that didn't stop people. It just made them better at sneaking around barns and blaming things on God's mysterious will. For women, getting out of a bad marriage was especially hard. Even if your husband was violent or vanished, society expected you to stay loyal, silent, and mildly pious while surviving off bread crusts and disapproval. Still, Some people made it work. Marriages weren't always happy, but they could become partnerships, forged by hardship, habit, and the shared experience of hauling firewood in the rain. Let's say your spouse dies. Maybe it was the plague. Maybe a farm accident. Maybe they tripped over a goose in the dark. However it happened, you're now widowed. And suddenly, the medieval dating pool opens back up. Being a widow in the Middle Ages was oddly liberating. Not do whatever you want liberating, but certainly more freedom than you had before. For women, especially, widowhood often brought a taste of independence, managing land, making decisions, even speaking in public without being immediately shushed. And if you were young-ish and still had teeth, you could remarry, quickly, very quickly. Mourning periods existed, but so did survival instincts. A widow with land and no husband was basically a walking treasure chest. Suitors appeared with alarming speed, some sincere, others just very enthusiastic about your dairy cows. If you're a man and recently widowed, society practically pushes you back into marriage. Who else is going to cook, clean, and raise the 11 children you somehow accumulated? So you start looking. Maybe the baker's daughter, maybe that quiet widow who always brings suspiciously good mead to market. Romance in second marriages could be surprisingly sweet. This time around, you're older, wiser. You're not being pushed into an alliance. You're choosing someone to survive with. Maybe even someone you like. Wild concept. Of course, there were rules. The church frowned on remarriage that happened too quickly. Like, your spouse isn't cold yet. Quickly. And widows often had to negotiate with family over dowries and inheritance. Nothing says romantic second chance like arguing with your brother-in-law over who keeps the butter churn. But still, second marriages were common, even expected. Life was short, winters were long. No one wanted to spend them alone if they didn't have to. And yes, love was part of it. Maybe not the swooning, sonnet-writing kind, but the quiet kind, based on shared stories, mutual respect, and the understanding that both of you had already seen some things. So you light the fire, pour the soup, and try again. Not because it's perfect, but because it's human. You've made it this far, survived the contracts, the courtships, the chaperones, and possibly a dramatic barn elopement. But before you fall for someone new, ask yourself the most medieval question of all. Are you cosmically allowed to love this person? Because in the Middle Ages, love wasn't just a matter of the heart. It was a matter of stars, bones, and whether or not your grandmother saw a fox this morning. Let's begin with astrology. Yes, before you kissed anyone, you might want to consult the local monk astrologer. Are your signs compatible? Is Venus in retrograde? Was your beloved born under an unlucky moon? If so, better to marry someone less cursed. Love is hard enough without planetary sabotage. Then there were birthmarks, mysterious little symbols that might identify you as your soulmate's long-lost twin, or their destined executioner. Superstitions were flexible like that. But the church had its own checklist. You couldn't marry your cousin, or your second cousin, or your fourth cousin twice removed, unless you had special permission, which the wealthy often bought, because loopholes. So before things got serious, you'd probably need to draw a family tree, and then quietly erase parts of it. Social status also mattered, deeply. A noble could not fall in love with a peasant without it being declared either a miracle or a moral failing. Cross-class romance was rare, scandalous, and only acceptable if it later became a tragic folk song. And then there were the omens. If a raven flew overhead while you were thinking about someone, bad sign. If you dropped bread at dinner while glancing at your crush, forget it. That's a cursed union. Someone might bury a charm under your doorstep to protect you from improper suitors, or to sabotage your chances. Either worked. Love, in this world, wasn't just personal. It was mystical. Everyone had an opinion. The stars, the saints, the weather, and that one woman in the woods who definitely wasn't a witch, except she probably was. But despite all the rules, signs, and whispered warnings, people still loved. Clumsily, bravely, often against advice. Because medieval or not, the heart remains wonderfully disobedient. You've probably heard of Alexander the Great, maybe even Julius Caesar, but have you ever heard of the woman who allegedly chopped off the head of Cyrus the Great and dunked it in blood? Her name was Tomyris, and she didn't rule from a throne gilded in gold or within high-walled cities. No, her court was the open sky, her army was the wind, and her power came not from titles, but from pure, unshakable authority. She was queen of the Massagetæ, a confederation of nomadic tribes who roamed the steppes of Central Asia. Think horse archers, tattooed warriors, ritual feasts, and battlefield justice. Tomyris didn't inherit her power from a pampered courtier system. She rose through grit, leadership, and possibly a healthy dose of "don't mess with me" energy. Her people were tough, accustomed to harsh winters, long migrations, and enemies on every side. But even among such people, she stood out. She was a warrior, a lawgiver, and a ruler in her own right. No husband overshadowed her. No brother guided her hand. Now, to be clear, much of what we know about Tomyris comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, a man not exactly known for his strict fact-checking. But if even a fraction of his account is true, then Tomyris wasn't just a queen. She was a storm in human form. At the heart of her story is this. A foreign superpower was growing stronger by the day. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, led by Cyrus the Great. He had already conquered Lydia and Babylon, and now his gaze turned east. The Massagetæ were next on his list. But Cyrus didn't fully understand what kind of woman he was dealing with. Before the first arrow flew, before the first spear shattered, and before her son's death changed everything, Tomyris was already preparing for war. Not because she wanted conquest, but because she refused submission. She wasn't just defending territory, she was defending a way of life. And as Cyrus would soon learn, there are some queens you just don't invade. Cyrus the Great had a reputation. He wasn't just any king, he was a conqueror's conqueror. The kind of man who could stroll into ancient cities, topple empires, and still get remembered fondly by historians. So when he looked east toward the land of the Massagetæ, he didn't exactly expect resistance. After all, who could possibly say no to the man who had taken Babylon without even breaking a sweat? Cyrus sent a polite offer first, because of course, every good imperialist starts with a smile. He proposed a political marriage between himself and Tomyris. Now you might think, that's romantic. But Tomyris saw right through it. She understood that this wasn't about love, or even alliance. It was about control. If she married Cyrus, her kingdom would become just another province of the Persian Empire, and she, a trophy queen. She declined, firmly. Cyrus, unaccustomed to rejection, didn't take it well. If he couldn't charm her into submission, he would take her kingdom by force. He crossed the Araxes River, which separated his empire from the lands of the Massagetæ, and established a foothold. But Tomyris wasn't idle. She gathered her warriors, consulted her chiefs, and prepared for what she knew was coming: war. Then came the bait. Cyrus, under the guidance of his general Harpagus, laid a trap. He left a portion of his army behind, with a lavish camp overflowing with wine and food, luxuries that nomads rarely indulged in. Tomyris' son, Spargapizes, led a detachment to investigate. They raided the camp, took the supplies, and, fatally, drank the wine. The Persians returned at just the right moment. Drunk, disoriented, and unprepared, Spargapizes and his men were overwhelmed. He was captured alive. When Tomyris heard the news, her world cracked. This wasn't just a military loss. It was personal. Her son, her heir, was now a prisoner in Persian hands. She sent a message to Cyrus. "Give me back my son and leave. If you do not, I swear by the sun, the master of the Massagetae, I will give you your fill of blood. Cyrus didn't listen. Spargapizes, ashamed of his capture, killed himself in Persian custody. Tomyris had just lost her only son, and now she was out for blood. Grief is a powerful thing. But grief mixed with fury, that's the recipe for absolute devastation. When Tomyris learned her son Spargapizes had taken his own life in Persian captivity, something inside her snapped. This was no longer about borders, pride, or even independence. This was war soaked in vengeance. And Tomyris wasn't one to grieve quietly. She didn't retire to her tent in mourning robes or weep by the fire. No, she mounted her horse, sharpened her weapons, and swore an oath that would echo through history. She would face Cyrus in battle, she would defeat him, and then she would make sure he never forgot her name, even in death. According to Herodotus, Tomyris summoned her tribal council. Under her command, the Massagetae mobilized. Picture it. Hundreds of warriors on horseback, adorned in leather armor, wielding bows and spears, faces painted with fury. They didn't march like a Persian army, they moved like a storm, swift, chaotic, and with deadly precision. This time, she set the trap. Cyrus, perhaps overconfident from his earlier deception, underestimated her resolve. But Tomyris knew his tactics now. She studied his movements, waited for the right moment, and then unleashed everything. The two armies clashed in what Herodotus describes as one of the bloodiest battles of the ancient world. There were no fancy formations or long speeches, just screaming horses, clashing blades, and a queen who fought alongside her warriors. No silk-robed empress here. Tomyris was in the thick of it, riding hard, cutting down enemies with merciless focus. And when the dust finally settled, Cyrus the Great was dead. Tomyris, ever theatrical in her justice, had his body searched. His head was severed, placed into a wineskin filled with blood, and presented as a final offering. According to Herodotus, she spoke to it. "You thirsted for blood, now drink your fill." Whether or not every detail is true is almost beside the point, because what matters is that Tomyris won. She crushed the most powerful empire of her day, avenged her son, and made sure that her name would be remembered, not as a victim, but as a conqueror. And this was just the start of her legend. The battlefield was silent. The Persians were dead or fleeing, their legendary king lifeless in the dust. And Tomyris? She didn't celebrate like a conqueror. She didn't parade through Persepolis or carve her face into coins. Instead, she stood over Cyrus's body, her vengeance fulfilled, but her heart still broken. Victory, it turned out, didn't bring peace. The Massagetae had won more than just a battle. They had turned the tide of empire. The death of Cyrus the Great sent shockwaves across the ancient world. In Babylon, Egypt, and the far corners of the Persian realm, rumours swirled. The unstoppable king had fallen, not at the hands of another great empire, but by a nomadic queen who had no throne, no palace, just fury, grit, and a cavalry of warriors who would ride into hell for her. And yet, Tomyris didn't exploit her victory for conquest. She returned to her people with the same pragmatism she ruled with. No war taxes, no imperial ambitions. She didn't try to seize the Persian throne. That wasn't her world. Her justice had been served. Her son had been avenged. The empire could continue without Cyrus, but now it would think twice before ever riding east again. It's worth noting just how rare this was. Most rulers, after winning a battle of that magnitude, would have grabbed power with both hands. But Tomyris seemed more concerned with preserving her people's freedom than expanding her reach. And yet, this is where her story begins to fade. There are no records of her after the battle, no statues, no royal tomb, no Massagetae monuments carved in stone. She rides into the fog of history, as elusive and untamed as the steppes themselves. Historians debate whether Herodotus exaggerated her tale. Some say Cyrus died elsewhere, that the wineskin of blood was poetic fiction. But even skeptics agree, someone dealt Persia a heavy blow. And it wasn't a king, it wasn't a general, it was a queen, a mother, a woman whose love for her son fueled one of the most dramatic reckonings in ancient history. And her story, it didn't need to be written in stone. It was carried by the wind. Because when the wind howls across the steppe, some still say it whispers her name, Tomyris. To understand Tomyris, you have to understand the people she led. The Massagetæ weren't your typical ancient civilization. No marble temples, no hanging gardens, no scrolls of poetry. They were a nomadic warrior culture living in the vast, untamed lands east of the Caspian Sea, lands too wild for Persian satraps or Babylonian scribes. Their world was one of movement, survival, and honour. Imagine sprawling plains without borders, herds of horses and cattle as currency, and warriors raised in the saddle. Children were taught to ride before they could walk straight. Archery wasn't a sport, it was second nature. Their bows were compact and deadly. Their armour? Layers of leather and scale, flexible for riding, sturdy for war. They hunted, they raided, and they fought to protect their freedom. And unlike many patriarchal societies of the time, Massagetæ women could, and did, fight. That wasn't an exception. It was expected. Warrior women weren't legends. They were your neighbours. So when Tomyris picked up a sword and led her people into battle, no one raised an eyebrow. She wasn't pretending to be a man or defying norms. She was the norm, just sharper, smarter, and far more dangerous than most. Their society valued strength, but also justice. Crimes were punished harshly, but fairly. Property was communal in many ways. What mattered was loyalty to the tribe and the ability to defend it. Kings and queens ruled, yes, but through consensus, not tyranny. Leaders had to prove themselves through deeds, not bloodlines. And as for religion, they were sun worshippers. Tomyris, in her famous warning to Cyrus, swore by the sun, the master of the Massagetæ. The sun was life, light, and justice, the divine judge of all oaths. To break one's word was to spit in the face of the heavens. In short, Tomyris wasn't some anomaly. She was the ideal embodiment of her people. Fierce, principled, proud. She didn't rise to power in spite of being a woman. She rose because she was exactly the kind of leader the Massagetæ revered. While the Persians had bureaucracy, the Massagetæ had freedom. And in one brutal, history-defining clash, that freedom held its ground. Because when you come from a land where the wind never stops, and the sky is your only ceiling, submission is simply not an option. You know what's strange? Everything we know about Tomyris, her battle with Cyrus, her son's death, the wineskin full of blood, it all comes from one man, Herodotus. Now, Herodotus is often called the father of history, which sounds great until you realise he's also the father of hearsay, myth and dramatic flair. The man loved a good story, and if that story involved divine omens, gory revenge, or queens shoving heads into blood, well, even better. So, how much of Tomyris's tale is true? That depends on how much you trust a Greek writing decades after the events, who had probably never met a single Massagetæ in his life. Herodotus relied on second-hand accounts, travellers' tales, and whatever rumours were circling the Persian Empire. To him, history wasn't just a record, it was a performance. Still, here's the thing. He chose to tell her story. In a world brimming with male warlords, tyrants and kings, Herodotus went out of his way to spotlight a steppe queen who brought down one of the greatest rulers in history. That's not nothing. But let's zoom out. Why did this tale spread so widely? Simple. It had everything. A noble woman, a tragic son, a cunning enemy, a battle to the death, a gory finale worthy of any Greek tragedy. If you were living in Athens or Thebes and heard this tale from a travelling bard, you'd remember Tomyris forever, not because she wore a crown, but because she dared to defy a superpower. and won. And over time, her story morphed. Medieval chronicles painted her as a savage Amazon. Renaissance artists depicted her drenched in blood, holding Cyrus's head like a trophy. She was exotic, fearsome, iconic. Yet through all the retellings, something real clings to her legend. Maybe not the exact dialogue, maybe not the wineskin, but the bones of the story, the queen, the sun, the war, the victory, feel too specific, too human, to be pure invention. In the end, Herodotus didn't just preserve Tomyris, he mythologized her. And while that may blur the lines between fact and fiction, it also ensured that her name would live far longer than Cyrus's imperial edicts. Because history forgets generals, but it remembers vengeance. For a queen with no surviving monuments, Tomyris has haunted the imagination of empires for over 2,000 years. Renaissance painters adored her. She was a dramatic muse, perfect for the bloody climax of a canvas. In 1622, Rubens painted her calmly holding a severed head, while courtiers looked on in awe. In another, she stands regal and composed, while Cyrus's decapitated head is ceremonially dunked into a golden vessel brimming with blood. Tasteful? Maybe not. Memorable? Absolutely. To European artists, Tomyris wasn't just a historical figure. She was symbolism incarnate. A woman who punished pride, a savage noble, a cautionary tale. A feminist icon, depending on who was holding the brush. She could represent the righteous fury of a mother, the barbarism of the East, or the wisdom of a ruler who refused to be bought. Writers loved her too. In the 18th and 19th centuries, she appeared in plays, novels, and philosophical tracts. Enlightenment thinkers debated whether she was proof that women could govern wisely, or a reminder of what happens when emotions rule leadership. Either way, she stayed in print. But oddly enough, her own people left no records. The Massagetæ faded from history, absorbed or erased by later nomadic cultures. No carved inscriptions, no burial mounds with gold plaques saying Tomyris was here. Her memory survived entirely through outsiders' eyes, and yet she kept reappearing. In Soviet-era Central Asia, Tomyris was reclaimed as a symbol of resistance against imperialism. Statues of her were erected in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. Modern scholars re-evaluated her not as a bloodthirsty barbarian, but as a legitimate head of state, a woman who ruled, led armies, and negotiated from a position of strength. She has appeared in everything from documentaries to video games. In one moment, she's a playable leader in a strategy game. In the next, she's being analysed in academic journals on gender and power. That's range. And here's the strange part. We still don't even know what she looked like. No coins, no busts, no carvings. But we know what she stood for. Strength, vengeance, autonomy, legacy. In a world that forgets queens who behave, Tomyris is remembered because she did not. She didn't ask to be part of history's art gallery. She kicked the door down and posed for the bloodiest portrait ever painted. Tomyris wasn't the first woman to lead warriors into battle, and she certainly wasn't the last. But history tends to treat women like her as exceptions, isolated flashes of power in a man's world. The truth? Tomyris was part of a long, often overlooked lineage of women who ruled through the sword. Let's rewind a bit. Before Tomyris, there was Shemuramat, the Assyrian queen who may have inspired the mythical Semiramis, builder of cities, slayer of rebels. Around the same era, the Scythians, cultural cousins of the Massagetæ, had female warriors buried with weapons, their skeletons showing clear signs of battle injuries. These weren't ceremonial roles. These women fought, bled, and died on horseback, and after Tomyris came more. Boudica, the Celtic queen who led a fiery revolt against the Roman Empire in the 1st century CE, is often compared to her. Like Tomyris, Boudica's war was sparked by personal loss. Her daughters were assaulted, her land seized. Her response? she burned Roman settlements to ash. The parallels are uncanny. Grief, vengeance,